Some folks spend their whole lives searching for where they belong, but Jeremiah Boone had found his peace in the Montana wilderness 23 years ago. After losing everything that mattered back in town, these quiet mountains had become his sanctuary, with only his faithful dog Rusty for company. One September morning, while gathering firewood near his cabin, he discovered something that would change everything. A massive pine tree had grown a strange bulge the size of a saddlebag, its bark split open and weeping dark sap. Rusty stood frozen beside the tree, whimpering and backing away like he'd seen a ghost. Jeremiah had learned to trust his dog's instincts. Over the years, and right now every fiber in Rusty's body was screaming danger. What could be growing inside that old tree that terrified a dog who'd never backed down from a bear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the peaks gold as Jeremiah Boone stepped onto his cabin's weathered porch, steam rising from the tin cup in his calloused hands. At 68, his body bore the marks of a hard life, a slight limp from an old logging accident, silver threading through his dark beard, and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. But up here, 8,000 feet above the world's troubles, he'd found something resembling peace. Rusty emerged from beneath the porch steps, his red coat dulled with age, but his amber eyes still sharp. The dog had been with him for 12 years. Now, since he'd found the pup abandoned on a mountain trail, half-starved and shivering. They'd grown old together in these mountains, two solitary souls, who understood that some hurts never fully heal, only fade with time and distance. Jeremiah reached for his hand-carved walking stick, its oak surface smooth from decades of use. He'd shaped it himself during his first winter in the cabin, when the loneliness had nearly driven him back to civilization. The stick had become an extension of himself, sturdy, reliable, and scarred from countless miles of mountain trails. 3 feet of solid oak, with a brass ferrule he'd salvaged from an old rifle, it served as walking aid, weapon, and companion, all in one. The cabin itself stood as testament to his determination to live apart from the world, built with his own hands from lodgepole pine and chinked with mud and moss. It squatted against the mountainside like it had grown there. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, his one concession to modern convenience. Inside, the simple life he'd built for himself, a stone fireplace, handmade furniture, shelves lined with books he'd read a dozen times over, and enough supplies to last through the harshest winter. He'd come here after the accident that changed everything. The memories still visited him in quiet moments. Sarah's laugh cut short by squealing tires and twisted metal, their unborn child lost with her. The drunk driver had walked away with barely a scratch, while Jeremiah's world crumbled to ash. The trial, the settlement money he'd never touched, the empty house in Billings that held too many ghosts. All of it drove him higher into these mountains until he found this hidden valley where grief could age like wine, becoming something bearable. Rusty padded beside him as they followed the familiar morning routine. First, check the solar battery bank and the small wind generator that supplemented his power, then split enough firewood for the day. The physical work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering down dark paths. At his age, he'd learned that idle moments were when the past came calling. The September air carried hints of the coming winter. Soon the aspen leaves would turn gold, then the first snows would dust the peaks. He'd need to finish gathering his winter wood supply, check the cabin's insulation, and make his final trip to town for supplies. The thought of town, even the small settlement of Glacier Creek 20 miles down the mountain, made his stomach tighten. Too many people, too many questions, too much noise after months of blessed silence. As they walked toward the stand of dead trees he'd been harvesting, Rusty suddenly stopped, his head cocked toward the north slope. The dog's ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Jeremiah followed his gaze to where a massive pine dominated the ridgeline. Even from this distance, something about the tree looked wrong. "What is it, boy?" Jeremiah asked, his voice rough from disuse. He spoke to Rusty more than any human these days, finding comfort in the one-sided conversations that required no explanation of his past. They approached the tree slowly, Jeremiah's experienced eye taking in details. The pine was old. Maybe 70 years, judging by its girth. But what caught his attention was the grotesque swelling in its trunk about 6 feet from the ground. The bulge stretched the bark until it had split in several places, weeping a dark, resinous sap that didn't look quite right. The smell that reached them was wrong too. Not the clean scent of pine resin, but something organic and unsettling. Rusty hung back, his usual boldness replaced by obvious unease. In all their years together, Jeremiah had seen his dog face down, black bears without flinching, but whatever was wrong with this tree had triggered every instinct the animal possessed. Rusty's hackles rose along his spine, and he whimpered in a way that made Jeremiah's own skin crawl. "Easy, boy," Jeremiah murmured, but his hand tightened on his walking stick. In 40 years of working in these mountains, first as a logger and then as a guide before his self-imposed exile, he'd never seen tree growth like this. Burls were common enough, twisted growths that formed when trees were injured or stressed, but this was different. The swelling was too uniform, too purposeful. He circled the tree, keeping his distance out of respect for Rusty's obvious distress. The growth faced east, toward the trail that wound up from the valley floor. From certain angles, the bulge almost looked like the tree was pregnant, carrying something that didn't belong inside its wooden flesh. As the sun climbed higher, painting the pine needles in shades of green and gold, Jeremiah found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories. Old Henrik Boone had been a logger in these mountains back when they still used crosscut saws and ox teams. He'd told tales around winter fires about trees that grew strange after witnessing violence, about the forest's way of keeping secrets. Jeremiah had dismissed such stories as the fancies of an old man trying to spook his grandson, but standing here now, he wondered if there might have been truth in those half-remembered tales. The wind picked up, setting the pine's branches to swaying and releasing more of that wrong-smelling sap. A few drops landed near Jeremiah's boots, and he noticed how they seemed thicker than normal resin, almost syrupy in consistency. Rusty backed further away, pressing against Jeremiah's legs and whining softly. "All right, boy, we'll leave it be. For now." But even as he spoke the words, Jeremiah knew he wouldn't be able to forget what he'd seen. The tree called to him, in the same way a loose thread calls to be pulled, promising answers he wasn't sure he wanted to know. They spent the rest of the morning gathering deadfall from the hillside below, but Jeremiah's eyes kept drifting back to the strange pine. Rusty seemed calmer once they'd put distance between themselves and the tree, but he never quite relaxed, periodically lifting his nose to test the wind, as if checking that the wrong smell hadn't followed them. By midday, they'd loaded the ATV, trailer with enough wood to last several days. The physical work felt good, reminding Jeremiah that despite his age, he was still strong, still capable. The mountains had kept him fit in ways that gym memberships and retirement communities never could. Out here, every day demanded something of him: split wood or freeze, hunt successfully or go hungry, maintain his equipment or face disaster when winter storms howled down from the peaks. As they drove back toward the cabin, the ATV's engine disturbing the afternoon quiet, Jeremiah caught himself glancing repeatedly at the pine tree. From this angle, the bulge was clearly visible against the sky, a dark shadow that seemed to watch their passage. The sight stirred something in his chest, part curiosity, part unease, and underneath it all, a growing certainty that his peaceful existence was about to change. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the western peaks, Jeremiah found his thoughts returning to the tree. Rusty lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to look toward the north slope. where the pine stood in silhouette against the darkening sky. The dog's continued agitation convinced Jeremiah that whatever was wrong with that tree went deeper than simple bark disease or insect damage. He'd learned to trust animal instincts during his years in the wilderness. Creatures that lived by their wits possessed senses that civilized humans had forgotten. When Rusty said something was wrong, something was wrong. The question was whether Jeremiah was brave enough or foolish enough to find out what. The stars emerged one by one as full darkness settled over the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its voice echoing off the stone faces of the surrounding peaks. The sound should have been comforting. Wolves meant the ecosystem remained healthy, the wild places still wild. But tonight, the howl seemed to carry a note of warning, as if the mountains themselves were trying to tell him something. As he prepared for bed, checking the wood stove and securing the cabin for the night, Jeremiah made a decision. Tomorrow, he would return to the tree with his tools and take a closer look. Whatever secrets it held, whatever had caused that unnatural growth, he needed to know. Some mysteries were meant to be solved, even if the answers changed everything. Dawn broke cold and clear, with frost painting the meadow grass silver. Jeremiah had slept poorly, his dreams filled with twisted trees, and Sarah's voice calling from somewhere just beyond reach. He rose before sunrise, as was his habit, but today felt different. Today carried the weight of decision. After his morning coffee, he gathered his tools with deliberate care. From the shed behind his cabin, he retrieved his great-grandfather's axe, a magnificent piece of craftsmanship forged in the 1890s when men still made tools to last generations. The hickory handle was worn smooth by 4 generations of Boone hands, its surface dark with age and honest sweat. The double-bit head, though pitted with rust spots, still held a keen edge that Jeremiah maintained with religious devotion. This axe had felled trees for homesteads, built barns that still stood, and cleared the land that fed his family for over a century. His great-grandfather Henrik had carried it west during the timber boom, when the mountains rang with the sound of crosscut saws and the crash of falling giants. The tool represented more than mere utility. It embodied the family legacy of hard work, self-reliance, and the courage to face whatever the wilderness demanded. Rusty watched from a safe distance as Jeremiah loaded his pack. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unsettled visitors, though Jeremiah had grown accustomed to feeling understood by his 4-legged companion. Today, those eyes seemed to plead with him to reconsider, to leave the strange tree alone and return to their peaceful routine. "I know, boy," Jeremiah said, shouldering his pack, "but some things need doing whether we want to or not." The walk to the pine took 20 minutes through terrain that would challenge most men half Jeremiah's age. Steep slopes covered in loose shale, deadfall that could trap an unwary foot, and hidden holes left by rotting stumps made every step a calculated risk. But Jeremiah moved with the confidence of a man who'd walked these mountains for decades, his weathered boots finding purchase where others would see only obstacles. The tree loomed larger as they approached, its unnatural bulge even more pronounced. In the morning light, the split bark wept more of that strange, dark sap, and the smell that reached them was stronger now, organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Rusty refused to come within 50 feet, instead positioning himself on a rocky outcrop where he could watch but maintain distance. Jeremiah set down his pack and studied the growth more carefully. Up close, he could see that the bark hadn't simply split from internal pressure. Something had pushed outward from inside the tree, stretching and finally breaking the outer layer. The exposed wood beneath was discolored, taking on a grayish hue that reminded him uncomfortably of old bone. He'd seen similar growths on trees that had been struck by lightning or damaged by avalanche debris, but this was different. The swelling was too regular, too contained. It was as if something had been deliberately placed inside the young tree decades ago, and the wood had grown around it like flesh around a splinter. The first touch of axe to bark sent Rusty into a frenzy of whimpering. The dog paced on his rocky perch, clearly torn between loyalty to his master and every instinct screaming at him to flee. Jeremiah paused, his weathered hands gripping the smooth hickory handle, and really looked at his companion. In 12 years together, he'd never seen Rusty display such obvious distress over anything short of a nearby grizzly. But curiosity had always been Jeremiah's weakness, the trait that had led him into logging in the first place, that had driven him to explore every hidden valley and secret trail in these mountains. Whatever lay inside this tree had been waiting for decades. It could wait a little longer while he made the first careful cut. The axe bit deep with a solid thunk that echoed off the surrounding ridges. Instead of the clean, resinous smell of fresh-cut pine, the breach released an odor that made Jeremiah step back involuntarily. It wasn't decay exactly, but something organic and preserved, like opening a root cellar that had been sealed too long. The wood itself felt wrong under the axe, softer than pine should be, almost spongy in places. The second cut revealed a hollow space within the trunk. Jeremiah's headlamp beam penetrated perhaps 6 inches into the cavity before disappearing, into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The walls of the hollow were smooth, worn by decades of the tree's growth, but clearly unnatural. No insect or disease created chambers like this. With growing unease, Jeremiah made a third cut, widening the opening enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold and his grip tighten on the axe handle until his knuckles went white. There, barely visible in the lamplight, was fabric. Old dark fabric that looked like leather but felt wrong when he touched it with the tip of his knife. The material was soft with age and damp from decades of entombment within the living tree. As Jeremiah carefully pulled at one edge, he realized he was looking at what had once been a jacket or coat, now so deteriorated that it came apart at his touch. Beneath it, his light caught the glint of metal, something that might have been a belt buckle or piece of jewelry. Rusty's whining reached a pitch that cut through the morning air like a blade. The dog was no longer pacing but sitting rigid, every muscle tensed as if preparing to bolt. His hackles stood at full attention, and a low growl rumbled from his chest, not the territorial warning he gave to bears or wolves, but something deeper, more primal. Jeremiah's hands shook as he set down the axe and stepped away from the tree. The implications of what he'd found hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't tree disease or natural growth. Someone had been sealed inside this pine decades ago, and the tree had grown around them like a living tomb. The morning sun, which had felt warm on his face when he began, now seemed cold and distant. The familiar sounds of the mountains, wind. Through the needles, the distant call of a hawk took on an ominous quality, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Even the air seemed thinner, harder to breathe, as the weight of discovery settled on his shoulders. He thought of all the times he'd walked past this tree over the years, sometimes close enough to touch its bark. How many storms had it weathered, while keeping it secret? How many seasons had passed, while something lay hidden in its wooden embrace? The idea that he'd been living in proximity to what amounted to a grave for over 2 decades made his skin crawl. Jeremiah packed his tools with shaking hands, his mind racing through possibilities. An accident victim who'd somehow become trapped? A murder victim hidden where no one would think to look? Someone who'd sought shelter in a young tree and died there, only to be gradually entombed as the wood grew around them. The walk back to his cabin passed in a blur of confused thoughts and growing dread. Rusty bounded ahead, clearly relieved to be leaving the sight behind, but kept looking back, as if to ensure his master was following. The dog's behavior only reinforced Jeremiah's certainty that they'd stumbled onto something terrible. Back at the cabin, Jeremiah sat on his porch steps and tried to process what he'd discovered. His hands still trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, the simple act of lifting it to his lips requiring conscious effort. In all his years in these mountains, through all the dangers and hardships he'd faced, nothing had shaken him like finding those remnants of fabric and metal within the tree. The rational part of his mind insisted he should contact the authorities immediately. The county sheriff's office, maybe the state police, someone who dealt with such things professionally. But another part of him, the part that had fled civilization after Sarah's death, recoiled from the idea of invasion. Once he made that call, his peaceful valley would be overrun with investigators, reporters, curiosity seekers. His sanctuary would be destroyed. As the sun climbed higher and the day warmed around him, Jeremiah made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would return to the tree with better tools and more light. He would carefully excavate whatever lay hidden in that wooden tomb, document what he found, and then decide how to proceed. He owed that much to whoever had been trapped there for so long. But tonight, he would try not to think about the fact that he'd been living for decades with the dead. Sleep had come in fragments that night, punctuated by dreams of trees that breathed, and whispered secrets he couldn't quite understand. Jeremiah woke before dawn with a headache and the taste of copper in his mouth, as if his body was rejecting what his mind had learned. But determination had crystallized during those restless hours. Whatever lay hidden in that pine deserved better than to remain a secret forever. This time he prepared more thoroughly. Along with the family axe, he packed his battery-powered worklight, a small crowbar, latex gloves he kept for cleaning fish, and a camera he'd bought years ago but rarely used. Most importantly, he brought a canvas tarp to carefully collect whatever he might find. Rusty followed reluctantly, staying closer to Jeremiah than usual, but maintaining his obvious distress. The dog's ears remained flat against his head as they approached the tree, and his tail hung low. Body language that spoke of deep unease that went beyond normal animal caution. The morning light revealed details Jeremiah had missed in his initial shock. The opening he'd cut yesterday gaped like a wound in the tree's trunk, and the dark sap had continued to weep overnight, creating sticky rivulets down the bark. The smell was stronger now, that wrong organic odor that made his stomach turn and his lungs protest. Setting up the worklight, Jeremiah illuminated the cavity fully for the first time. What he saw made him sit back on his heels, overwhelmed by the implications. The hollow was larger than he'd imagined, perhaps 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, carved into the tree's heartwood by decades of growth around whatever had been placed there. The fabric he'd glimpsed yesterday was more extensive than a simple jacket. Laid out in the unforgiving light, he could see the remains of what had once been clothing, a leather jacket, pants, and what might have been boots. All of it was darkened, with age and moisture taking on the color of old blood. But it was the condition of the leather that made his breath catch. This wasn't the cracked, brittle decay he'd expect from decades of exposure. Instead, the materials had been preserved by the tree's chemistry, tanned and maintained by the constant flow of sap and the sealed environment. The leather was supple, almost alive to the touch, as if its original owner had only recently removed. Jeremiah pulled on the latex gloves with hands that shook slightly. Whatever religious beliefs he'd maintained after Sarah's death felt inadequate for this moment. He was about to disturb someone's final rest, to violate a tomb that nature had carefully maintained for decades. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy pack. The leather jacket came away in pieces, some sections intact enough to recognize pockets and seams, others so deteriorated they crumbled at his touch. But in the inner pocket, protected by multiple layers of material, his fingers found something solid, a wallet. The wallet itself was a revelation. Made of thick cowhide that had aged to the color of mahogany, it bore the distinctive wear patterns of daily use. The corners rounded smooth, the fold lines softened by years in a back pocket. When Jeremiah opened it carefully, fighting the stiffness of aged leather, he found the contents remarkably well preserved. Credit cards had warped and faded beyond recognition, their plastic showing the effects of decades in a damp environment. But paper money, protected by the wallet's folds, remained partially legible. More importantly, in the clear plastic window where most men kept their driver's license, he found exactly what he'd hoped and feared to discover. The license was water-damaged and faded, but readable enough to make out a name: Thomas Mitchell. The address was illegible, but the birth date was clear enough: March 15th, 1954. If the license was current when its owner died, Thomas Mitchell had been 33 years old when he met his fate in this remote valley. Jeremiah sat back against a nearby boulder, the license in his gloved hands, trying to process the reality of what he'd discovered. This wasn't an anonymous victim anymore. This was Thomas Mitchell, born in 1954, young enough to have a family somewhere, old enough to have made his mark on the world. Someone had loved him, worried about him when he didn't come home, perhaps spent years wondering what had happened to their son, brother, husband, or father. The implications grew more disturbing as Jeremiah continued his careful excavation. The position of the remains suggested Thomas hadn't simply fallen into a natural hollow in the tree. The clothing was too arranged, too intact for that. Someone had placed him here deliberately, perhaps when the tree was young enough that its trunk could be hollowed out, then relied on natural growth to seal the evidence forever. Rusty's agitation had reached a new level. The dog paced in tight circles on his rocky perch, occasionally letting out sharp barks that echoed off the surrounding ridges. It was as if he could sense something beyond the physical evidence, some lingering wrongness that clung to this place despite the decades that had passed. As Jeremiah worked deeper into the cavity, his light revealed more personal effects. A wristwatch, its leather band preserved but its face clouded with moisture. A small pocket knife with a bone handle, the kind of practical tool any outdoorsman would carry. Most significantly, a key ring holding what appeared to be car keys. Heavy, metal keys from an era before remote entry systems and plastic fobs. Each item told a story. The watch suggested someone who valued punctuality, who had places to be and people counting on him. The knife spoke of practical experience in the outdoors, someone comfortable enough in the wilderness to carry quality tools. The keys meant a vehicle, probably parked somewhere nearby when Thomas Mitchell met his end. But it was the final item that made Jeremiah's blood run cold. Wedged deep in the cavity, almost lost in the shadows, was a small leather satchel. Unlike the clothing, this had been deliberately placed, positioned to protect its contents from the tree's moisture and chemistry. When Jeremiah carefully extracted it and worked open the aged brass clasp, he found papers inside. The papers were fragmentary, damaged by decades of storage, but enough remained to make out portions of text. What he could read suggested official documents, perhaps permits or licenses of some kind. More disturbing were what appeared to be photographs, their emulsion damaged but still showing partial images of people and places he didn't recognize. One photograph, better preserved than the others, showed a young man with dark hair and a confident smile, standing beside what looked like a trail marker. The image quality was poor and faded, but something about the facial features reminded Jeremiah of the driver's license photo. This might be Thomas Mitchell himself, captured during what could have been his final hiking trip. As the sun reached its zenith, Jeremiah carefully packed his discoveries into the canvas tarp. Each item felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, evidence of a life interrupted and hidden away where no one would think to look. The methodical nature of the concealment suggested this wasn't a crime of passion or accident, but something planned and deliberate. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual, weighted down by more than just physical evidence. Jeremiah carried the knowledge that his peaceful valley had harbored a terrible secret for decades, that someone had used the forest's own growth to hide their crime. Worse, the careful preservation of the evidence suggested the perpetrator had understood exactly how the tree would grow around their handiwork, implying intimate knowledge of these mountains and their secrets. That evening, Jeremiah spread his findings on his kitchen table under the harsh light of a Coleman lantern. Each item seemed to accuse him of something. Neglect, perhaps, for living so close to Thomas Mitchell's grave without knowing it was there. The young man in the photograph smiled up at him, frozen in a moment of happiness that had preceded whatever brought him to his final resting place in the hollow pine. Somewhere out there, someone had gotten away with murder for over 30 years. The abandoned ranger station sat like a weathered monument to better-funded times, its log walls silvered by decades of mountain weather. Jeremiah hadn't visited the place in years, but the building had been locked and empty since budget cuts forced the Forest Service to consolidate operations 20 miles down the valley. Today, however, he needed what might be stored in its dusty filing cabinets. The lock on the front door had been broken years ago, probably by hunters seeking shelter during storms. Inside, everything remained exactly as the last ranger had left it. Maps still pinned to walls, coffee-stained mugs sitting on desks, and most importantly, filing cabinets that might hold records from the 1980s. Rusty waited outside, still agitated. From their return to the area near the pine tree, the dog had refused to come within a quarter-mile of the site, forcing Jeremiah to take a longer route through the valley to reach the old station. Even now, Rusty paced nervously, occasionally looking toward the ridge where the tree stood like a dark sentinel against the sky. The filing cabinets were unlocked, their contents a jumbled mix of incident reports, trail maintenance logs, and missing person cases dating back to when this station still operated. Jeremiah pulled files methodically, looking for anything from 1987 that might relate to Thomas Mitchell. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through dirty windows as he worked, the silence broken only by the whisper of turning pages and Rusty's occasional whine from outside. He found what he was looking for in the third cabinet, filed under Missing Persons, 1987. The folder was thick with reports, photographs, and handwritten notes that painted a picture of a busy hiking season that year. But one report made his hands stop trembling and his breath catch in his throat. The missing person report for Thomas Edward Mitchell, filed on September 15, 1987, by his wife Jennifer Mitchell of Missoula. According to the details, Thomas had left for a 3-day solo hiking trip in the Glacier Creek area on September 12th, planning to return by the evening of September 14th. When he failed to return, his wife contacted local authorities, and a search was initiated. The report included a photograph, a clear official image that showed the same confident smile Jeremiah had seen in the damaged photo from the leather satchel. Thomas Mitchell had been 33 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 175 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. An experienced hiker and outdoorsman, he'd been carrying standard camping gear for a multi-day trip. More disturbing was the search summary attached to the report. Multiple teams had scoured the area for 2 weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness. They'd found his vehicle, a 1984 Toyota pickup, parked at the Granite Creek trailhead, exactly where he'd told his wife he would start his hike. But despite extensive ground and air searches, no trace of Thomas Mitchell himself had ever been discovered. The file contained a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Missoula paper, dated October 3rd, 1987. The headline read, "Search for Missing Hiker Called Off." The article quoted the lead searcher, Deputy Sheriff Dale Hawkins, saying that despite extensive efforts, they'd found no evidence of foul play and assumed Mitchell had suffered an accident in remote terrain where his body might never be recovered. Jeremiah studied the search map included in the file, comparing it to his mental picture of the valley's geography. The search teams had covered the obvious trails and camping areas, but they'd missed the ridge where the pine tree stood. It was accessible terrain, but off the main hiking routes. Exactly the kind of place someone might go to hide evidence, or where an experienced outdoorsman might venture to find solitude. What struck him most was the search duration. 2 weeks was extensive for a missing hiker, suggesting either unusual circumstances or exceptional effort by the authorities. The reports showed they'd used dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers. They'd questioned other hikers, checked with local guides, and even consulted with old-timers who knew the mountain's secrets. Yet somehow they'd missed finding Thomas Mitchell by perhaps half a mile. The file also contained personal details that made Thomas Mitchell more than just a name on a license. He'd been a geological surveyor for the state, married for 8 years, with no children but plans to start a family. His wife's statement described him as methodical and safety-conscious, someone who always filed detailed hiking plans and carried emergency gear, the kind of man who didn't simply vanish without a trace. Jennifer Mitchell's final statement, taken 3 weeks after her husband's disappearance, was heartbreaking in its simple dignity. She expressed gratitude for the search efforts, while maintaining hope that Thomas might still be found alive. She described their last conversation, how excited he'd been about exploring new territory, how he'd promised to take her to his favorite viewpoint when he returned. 36 years later, Jeremiah was the one who would have to tell her that her husband had never made it to that viewpoint, that he'd died within a day of beginning his adventure, hidden away where no search team would think to look. But as he continued reading, another detail caught his attention. The report mentioned that Thomas had carried a topographical map marked with his intended route, a map that wasn't found with his vehicle. According to his wife, he'd spent weeks planning this particular trip, researching areas he'd never explored before. The missing map suggested he might have deviated from his filed plan, perhaps following a lead or recommendation from someone who knew the area well. The thought made Jeremiah's skin crawl. What if Thomas Mitchell hadn't wandered off the main trails by accident? What if someone had deliberately directed him to that remote ridge, knowing it would be the perfect place to commit murder and hide the evidence? The careful placement of the body in the hollow tree spoke of local knowledge, someone who understood how the forest would reclaim and conceal their crime. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the ranger station floor, Jeremiah photographed the relevant documents with his old camera. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Thomas Mitchell had been an experienced hiker who'd planned his route carefully, yet he'd ended up dead in a location far from any recognized trail. His body had been concealed with knowledge and skill that suggested familiarity with the areas, geography and forest growth patterns. The drive back to his cabin passed in contemplative silence, Rusty riding in the passenger seat with his ears pricked forward as if sensing his master's troubled thoughts. Jeremiah's mind churned through possibilities and implications. Someone in this area had killed Thomas Mitchell in 1987 and gotten away with it. That someone might still be alive, might still be living nearby, might even be someone Jeremiah had encountered during his occasional trips to town. The idea that he'd been sharing these mountains with a murderer for over 2 decades made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. His sanctuary had been built unknowingly atop a foundation of violence and deception. The peace he'd found here was tainted by the knowledge that somewhere nearby a killer had lived comfortably with their secret for 36 years. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the western peaks, Jeremiah made a decision that would change the course of his remaining years. He would find out who had killed Thomas Mitchell. He would learn why an innocent man had died in these mountains and been hidden away like a shameful secret. And somehow he would see that justice was finally done, even if it meant sacrificing the solitude that had kept him sane since Sarah's death. The mountains kept their secrets well, but Jeremiah Boone was about to prove that some secrets were too heavy for even the ancient pines to carry forever. The return to the pine tree felt like approaching a gravesite, which Jeremiah supposed it was. Armed with better tools and grim determination, he'd decided to complete the excavation properly. Thomas Mitchell deserved to have all his belongings recovered with dignity, and Jeremiah needed to understand exactly what had happened in this remote spot 36 years ago. This time, he brought archaeological tools borrowed from his old life. Small, Brushes, plastic bags for evidence, and a folding camp table where he could properly examine each discovery. The water-damaged driver's license lay in a clear evidence bag, its edges soft and discolored, but still readable enough to confirm what the missing person report had told him. Thomas Edward Mitchell, date of birth, March 15, 1954. Address, 2847 Maple Street, Missoula, Montana. The license had expired in 1989, 2 years after Thomas disappeared, a small detail that spoke to the bureaucratic machinery that had continued grinding long after the man himself had vanished from the world. But it was the photograph on the license that haunted Jeremiah most. Unlike the casual snapshot from Thomas's hiking gear, this official image captured something essential about the man. Intelligent eyes, a slight smile that suggested someone comfortable with himself, the kind of face that belonged to someone who coached Little League or volunteered at community events. This wasn't just a missing hiker anymore. This was someone's son, husband, friend. Working methodically, Jeremiah continued the excavation around where the torso would have been. The tree's growth had been remarkable in its thoroughness. Over decades, the wood had flowed around the remains like slow water, preserving everything in a wooden sarcophagus that had protected the evidence better than any conscious burial. More personal items emerged from the hollow. A college class ring from Montana State University, engraved with the year 1976 and the letters TEM. A pocket watch that had stopped at 3:17, its hands frozen at the moment its mechanism finally succumbed to moisture. Most significantly, a larger wallet-like object that proved to be Thomas's field notebook, its leather cover embossed with the Montana State Geological Survey logo. The notebook was a revelation. Despite decades in the hollow tree, enough pages remained legible to reconstruct Thomas's final days. His handwriting was precise, the notes of someone trained to observe and record geological features with scientific accuracy. The entries began 3 days before his disappearance, documenting his route, weather conditions, and geological observations along the way. September 12, 1987. Started at Granite Creek Trailhead, owed 800 hours. Weather clear, temperature 45°F. Following main trail for first 5 miles, then branching east toward unmarked drainage. Local at gas station mentioned possible mineral formations in area, worth investigating. The mention of a local contact made. Jeremiah pause. Thomas hadn't just wandered into this remote area by chance. Someone had directed him here, someone who knew about geological formations that would interest a state surveyor. The implications were disturbing. Had Thomas been lured to this isolated spot by someone who intended harm? September 13th. Found. Drainage described by local contact. Significant granite intrusions visible along creek bed. Unusual mineral veining in exposed rock faces. We'll spend extra day documenting. This could be significant for regional survey. The final entry was dated September 14th, the day Thomas was supposed to return home. Early morning reconnaissance of upper drainage, met local guide as arranged, claims to know location of extensive mineral deposits further up ridge. Following, his route to investigate, should be back to vehicle by evening. Jeremiah read the final entry 3 times, his blood growing colder with each reading. Thomas Mitchell hadn't simply gotten lost or had an accident. He'd been deliberately led to this remote area by someone he'd trusted, someone who'd posed as a helpful local guide. The methodical way the body had been concealed in the hollow tree suddenly made perfect sense. The killer had intimate knowledge of the area and had planned this crime carefully. The notebook's back pages contained rough maps sketched in Thomas's precise hand, showing his intended route and marking the location where he'd planned to meet his guide. The spot was less than a mile from where his remains now lay, close enough that he'd walked willingly to his death, probably excited about the geological discoveries he'd been promised. As Jeremiah continued his careful excavation, he found more evidence of the crime's premeditated nature. Thomas's camping gear was present, but unused. Sleeping bag still in its stuff sack, camp stove still clean, food supplies barely touched. He'd been killed on his first or second day in the wilderness, before he'd had time to establish a proper camp. Most telling was the condition of his hiking boots. The leather was scuffed and worn from regular use, but the sole patterns showed. He'd done very little walking on rocky terrain during this final trip. Instead of the deep wilderness exploration his notebook described, Thomas had been led relatively quickly to this isolated spot and murdered there. The methodical arrangement of the body and belongings within the tree hollow suggested the killer had taken time to ensure nothing would be discovered accidentally. Everything had been positioned to take advantage of the tree's natural growth, creating a living tomb that would seal itself over the decades. This wasn't the panicked concealment of an accidental killing. This was the work of someone who'd thought through every detail. Jeremiah sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the implications of what he'd discovered. Thomas Mitchell had been murdered by someone who knew these mountains intimately, someone who understood how trees grew and how forest processes would conceal evidence. The killer had posed as a helpful local, probably someone Thomas had no reason to distrust, someone who might even have had a legitimate reason to be knowledgeable about geological formations. The realization that struck him like a physical blow was that the killer was probably still alive. In 1987, someone young enough and strong enough to hike these mountains and overpower a healthy 33-year-old man would likely be in their 60s or 70s now, elderly but potentially still living in the area. Jeremiah might have encountered the murderer during his occasional trips to town, might have nodded politely to them at the general store or gas station. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the excavation site, Jeremiah carefully bagged and catalogued each piece of evidence. Thomas Mitchell's driver's license went into its own protective envelope, a tangible connection to the life that had been cut short in this remote place. The notebook, with its damning final entries, was perhaps the most important evidence of all. Proof that Thomas had been deliberately lured to his death by someone he'd trusted. Rusty had remained at his distant observation post throughout the day, but as Jeremiah began packing his tools, the dog's demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward and his body tensed, focused on something beyond Jeremiah's awareness. A low growl rumbled from his chest, the kind of warning he gave when detecting human presence in the wilderness. Jeremiah froze, listening intently to the mountain's silence. At first, he heard nothing unusual. Wind in the pines, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But then, barely audible over the natural sounds, came the soft crunch of footsteps on dead leaves, approaching from the direction of the old hunting trail. Someone was coming, someone who moved with the careful stealth of a person trying not to be detected. Jeremiah's hand instinctively moved to his walking stick, his military training surfacing after decades of dormancy. Whoever was approaching had chosen to move quietly rather than announce their presence with a friendly hello, and that suggested intentions that weren't entirely innocent. The footsteps stopped, close enough that Jeremiah could sense a human presence but still hidden by the dense forest growth. Someone was watching him, evaluating the situation, perhaps deciding whether to reveal themselves or retreat undetected. The silence stretched taut between them, predator and prey trying to determine which was which. After 36 years, Thomas Mitchell's killer might have finally returned to check on their handiwork, only to discover that their perfect crime was perfect no longer. The footsteps retreated as quietly as they'd approached, leaving Jeremiah alone with his racing heart and the growing certainty that his investigation had been observed. Whoever had been watching from the forest had decided retreat was wiser than confrontation, but their presence confirmed his worst suspicions. Someone was very interested in what he'd discovered at the pine tree. Back at his cabin that evening, Jeremiah spread Thomas Mitchell's belongings across his kitchen table under the harsh light of his Coleman lantern. Among the items was something he'd initially overlooked, a hand-drawn trail map tucked between the pages of the Geological Survey notebook. The paper was water-stained and fragile, but the pencil marks remained clear enough to read. The map showed far more detail than any official trail guide. Someone had marked not just the main hiking routes, but also game trails, seasonal water sources, hidden campsites, and geographical features that wouldn't appear on standard topographical maps. Most significantly, the map showed a route that deviated sharply from the trail Thomas had officially filed with his wife, a route that led directly to the ridge where his body had been discovered. The handwriting on the map wasn't Thomas's precise script. This was someone else's work, drawn by someone with intimate knowledge of the mountain's hidden geography. Notations in the margins indicated things like good hunting blind, deer crossing, and old mining camp ruins, the kind of local knowledge that came from decades of experience in these mountains. One marking made Jeremiah's blood run cold, HC, written next to a small square symbol about a mile from where Thomas's body had been found. The symbol clearly represented a building or structure, and the initials suggested someone's personal shorthand for identifying it. If HC stood for hunting cabin, it meant there was a structure nearby that Thomas's killer might still be using. Day 2. Next morning, despite Rusty's obvious reluctance, Jeremiah set out to find the cabin marked on the mysterious map. He carried his walking stick and a small day pack with emergency supplies, but left his phone behind. Cell service was non-existent in this part of the mountains anyway, and he preferred to approach the situation with the stealth his military training had taught him. The route shown on the map proved accurate in every detail. Hidden game trails connected exactly where indicated, and seasonal landmarks matched the notations perfectly. Whoever had drawn this map knew these mountains, as well as Jeremiah knew his own cabin, perhaps better. The knowledge displayed here came from years of careful observation, the kind of familiarity that suggested someone who spent significant time in the wilderness, either by profession or by choice. Rusty's behavior grew increasingly agitated as they followed the map's route. The dog's ears remained flat against his head, and he frequently stopped to sniff the air or stare into the dense forest around them. His instincts were clearly warning of something wrong, something that went beyond the normal predator-prey relationships of the wilderness. The cabin, when Jeremiah finally spotted it through the trees, was exactly where the map indicated, but appeared to be abandoned. Built from local logs and chinked with mud and moss, it blended so well with the surrounding forest that it would be nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know its exact location. The structure was old, probably dating to the early logging days, but showed signs of recent maintenance that contradicted its abandoned appearance. From his concealed position behind a fallen tree, Jeremiah observed the cabin for over an hour. No smoke rose from the chimney, no sounds emerged from within, and no movement was visible through the dirty windows. But something about the scene felt staged, too perfectly abandoned to be genuinely empty. Fresh tire tracks in the muddy area near the cabin suggested recent vehicle access, despite the fact that no road was visible from Jeremiah's position. When he finally approached the building, moving with the careful stealth his military service had taught him, the details he observed confirmed his suspicions. The cabin was being actively used, despite efforts to make it appear otherwise. The windows had been deliberately dirtied from the outside to obscure the interior, but the glass itself was intact and recently cleaned from within. The door showed fresh oil on its hinges, and the wooden steps had been recently repaired. Most telling was what he found around the back of the cabin. A generator housing that tried to look like an old woodshed, solar panels concealed under camouflage, netting, and a well-hidden trail that led to what was probably a concealed vehicle access point. Someone had invested considerable time and money in making this remote cabin fully functional while maintaining its abandoned appearance. Peering through a gap in the curtained windows, Jeremiah could see the interior was clean and well appointed. modern camping equipment, a propane cooking system, battery-powered lights, and what appeared to be communication equipment suggested this was more than a simple hunting cabin. This was a sophisticated base of operations for someone who wanted to operate in the mountains without detection. But it was what he found near the cabin's foundation that made his hands shake with rage and certainty. Partially buried under years of accumulated leaves and debris were fragments of camping gear, pieces of nylon fabric, broken plastic buckles, and metal hardware that matched the era and style of Thomas Mitchell's equipment. Someone had cleaned up after the murder by disposing of evidence at their secret base, confident it would never be discovered. The implications were staggering. Thomas Mitchell's killer hadn't just known these mountains well. They'd maintained a hidden facility here for decades, probably using it for illegal activities that required secrecy and isolation. The careful concealment of the cabin suggested ongoing criminal operations, possibly poaching, drug manufacturing, or other activities that required avoiding law enforcement detection. As Jeremiah photographed the evidence with his old camera, being careful not to disturb anything that might be useful to investigators, he began to understand the scope of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a decades-old murder case. This was an active criminal operation that had been using Thomas Mitchell's death as part of a larger pattern of illegal activity in the remote mountains. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him freeze behind the cabin's back wall. Through the trees, he could see dust rising from the hidden access trail, and the steady growl of a truck engine grew louder as it approached the clearing. Someone was coming to the cabin, and Jeremiah was trapped in the open with nowhere to hide. Rusty, who had been nervously pacing the tree line, suddenly bolted into the forest with a sharp whine of fear. The dog's flight was so precipitous that Jeremiah knew whoever was approaching represented genuine danger. Not just discovery, but real physical threat to his safety. The engine sound stopped just beyond the tree line, followed by the slam of truck doors and the low murmur of voices. Multiple people had arrived, and they were approaching the cabin with the confident stride of people who belonged there. Jeremiah pressed himself against the cabin's back wall, his heart hammering as he tried to decide whether to run or hide. Through a gap between the logs, he could see two men approaching the front door, one elderly but still powerfully built, the other younger and moving with the loose-limbed confidence of someone comfortable with violence. Both wore hunting clothes and carried weapons, but their bearing suggested this was business rather than recreation. "Thought I saw tracks around." "The tree yesterday," the older man was saying as they reached the cabin door. "Someone's been digging around up there and I don't like it." The younger man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "After all these years, who'd be stupid enough to mess with that old pine?" "Same kind of stupid that got Mitchell killed in the first place," the older man replied, producing a key from his pocket. "Some people just can't leave well enough alone." As the men entered the cabin, Jeremiah realized with growing horror that he was listening to Thomas Mitchell's killers, and they already knew about his investigation. Jeremiah remained frozen against the cabin wall, listening to the conversation. Inside, while his mind raced through escape options, the forest around him seemed to hold its breath, every shadow potentially concealing more threats. Through the gap in the logs, he could see the two men moving around the cabin's interior with the familiarity of long use. "Check the equipment," the older man ordered. "Make sure everything's secure. If someone's nosing around the tree, they might find this place next." The younger man's boots creaked across the cabin floor as he moved to what sounded like storage areas. "You really think it matters after all this time? Even if they found something, who'd believe it?" "You weren't here in '87, the older man replied, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. "You don't know how close it came to falling apart. One nosy surveyor almost brought down everything we'd built." Jeremiah's blood chilled at the casual reference to Thomas Mitchell. These weren't just criminals, they were the actual killers, discussing their victim like he'd been nothing more than an inconvenience to their operations. The callousness in their voices made his hands clench into fists, military training warring. With basic human decency, the conversation continued as the men conducted what appeared to be routine maintenance on their hidden facility. References to shipments, routes, and contacts painted a picture of ongoing criminal activity that had been operating in these mountains for decades. Thomas Mitchell had stumbled into something much larger than a simple geological survey, and it had cost him his life. "Found something you need to see," the younger man called from what sounded like a back room. His voice carried a note of concern that made the older man's footsteps quicken across the cabin floor. "What is it?" "Looks like someone broke into the old storage chest. Some of Mitchell's gear is missing." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jeremiah realized with growing dread that they were talking about evidence he'd already removed from the tree, evidence that would now clearly point to his involvement in the investigation. "How much is missing?" the older man asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Hard to say. Looks like they took the small stuff. Wallet, notebook, maybe some other personal items. Left the camping gear." "Smart. Someone who knows what they're looking for." The older man's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "This isn't some random hiker stumbling across something. This is deliberate." Jeremiah heard footsteps approaching his side of the cabin and pressed himself harder against the wall, hoping the shadows would conceal him. Through the window above his head, he could see the older man's profile as he stared out toward the forest, clearly thinking through the implications of the discovery. It was then that Jeremiah saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Pinned to the man's shirt, partially concealed by his jacket, was a tarnished badge. Even from his limited angle, Jeremiah could make out enough of the design to recognize what it was. A law enforcement badge from the 1980s era. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Thomas Mitchell hadn't been killed by random criminals, or even organized poachers. He'd been murdered by someone in law enforcement, someone who'd used their official position to lure him to his death and then cover up the crime. The badge explained everything: how the investigation had been called off so quickly, how evidence had been overlooked, how a sophisticated criminal operation had continued operating in these mountains for decades without interference. "We need to find out who's been digging around up there," the older man continued, still staring out the window. "And we need to do it before they piece together what really happened." "You want me to start asking around town?" the younger man suggested. "Someone's bound to have seen whoever's been poking around the mountains." "No, too obvious. But keep your ears open and increase patrols up here. If someone's gotten curious about that tree, they'll be back." Jeremiah realized with growing horror that he was listening to active planning for another murder. These men had killed once to protect their operation, and they were clearly prepared to kill again. The casual way they discussed eliminating threats suggested this wasn't the first time they'd had to deal with inconvenient witnesses. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor indicated the men were preparing to leave. Jeremiah knew he had only minutes to escape before they emerged from the cabin and potentially spotted him. But as he prepared to slip away into the forest, he heard something that made him pause, despite the danger. "Bring the old evidence box," the older man ordered. "Time to make sure everything from the Mitchell case gets properly disposed of. Should have done it years ago." All of it. Everything. The real police report, the photographs we kept back, the surveyor's equipment we couldn't risk dumping with the body. Clean slate. Jeremiah's mind raced. There was additional evidence from Thomas Mitchell's murder, evidence that had been kept by corrupt law enforcement officials for over 3 decades. If he could somehow get access to that evidence box, it might provide the proof needed to finally bring justice for Thomas and expose the entire criminal operation. But first, he had to survive the next few minutes. The cabin door opened with a squeal of hinges, and Jeremiah heard boots on the wooden steps. He pressed himself against the cabin wall and began moving slowly toward the back corner, hoping to put the building between himself and the emerging men. Every footstep felt thunderous. In the mountain silence, every breath seemed loud enough to give away his position. "I still don't like it," the younger man was saying, as they walked toward their hidden vehicle. "After all these years of perfect cover, now someone starts digging around. Makes me nervous." "Should make you nervous," the older man replied. "But nervous keeps you alive. Overconfident is what gets you caught." Their voices faded as they moved away from the cabin, but Jeremiah remained frozen against the wall until he heard their truck engines start and begin moving away down the hidden trail. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally, his heart hammering against his ribs as the full implications of what he'd learned settled over him. Thomas Mitchell had been murdered by corrupt law enforcement, probably as part of a larger criminal conspiracy that had been operating in these mountains. For decades, the investigation into his disappearance had been deliberately sabotaged from within, ensuring that no evidence would ever surface to threaten the operation. The perfect isolation of the mountains, combined with official protection, had created an ideal environment for long-term criminal activity. But now Jeremiah knew the truth, and that knowledge made him a target. The men he'd overheard were already planning to eliminate whoever had been investigating the tree. They had the resources, the local knowledge, and the official protection needed to make someone disappear permanently in these vast mountains. As he waited for their truck sounds to fade completely before attempting to move, Jeremiah thought about his options. He could pack up and leave immediately, abandon his cabin and disappear into the anonymity of distant cities, but that would mean Thomas Mitchell's killers would continue to escape justice, would continue their criminal operations, might continue to kill anyone who threatened their security, or he could stay and fight, using his military training and knowledge of these mountains to gather evidence and expose the conspiracy. But that path led almost certainly to confrontation with dangerous men who had already proven they would kill to protect their secrets. When the mountain silence finally returned, broken only by natural sounds of wind and wildlife, Jeremiah began his careful retreat toward where he'd left Rusty. The dog was waiting in the agreed-upon spot, his relief at seeing his master evident in every line of his body. But Rusty's continued agitation confirmed that the danger was far from over. As they made their way back toward the cabin through routes that avoided any possibility of detection, Jeremiah found himself thinking about the sheriff's badge he'd glimpsed. Somewhere in town, a corrupt law enforcement official was walking around free, probably still in a position of authority, still protecting the criminal operation that had claimed Thomas Mitchell's life. The badge represented more than just corruption. It represented a betrayal of everything law enforcement was supposed to stand for. Someone had taken an oath to protect and serve, then used that authority to murder an innocent man and cover up the crime for decades. But badges could be traced, and official positions left paper trails. If Jeremiah could identify which law enforcement agency the badge belonged to, he might be able to narrow down his suspects and build a case that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore. The war he'd thought he'd left behind in the military had finally followed him to his mountain sanctuary. But this time, he would be fighting for more than territory or politics. This time, he would be fighting for justice for a young man who died simply because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thomas Mitchell deserved better than to remain a secret, buried in a hollow tree, and Jeremiah Boone was going to make sure he got it. That night, sleep came in fragments, haunted by memories Jeremiah had spent decades trying to forget. The smell of jungle rot, the weight of equipment. On his back, the terrible clarity that came with knowing enemies were hunting you through hostile terrain. He'd thought those days were behind him, buried with his uniform in the back of a closet he rarely opened. But survival instincts, once honed by necessity, never fully disappeared. By dawn, he'd made his decision. The rational choice would be to contact federal authorities, FBI, state police, someone outside the local corruption web, but rational choices required evidence that wouldn't get him killed before he could deliver it, and time he might not have. The men at the cabin had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats, and they possessed resources and local knowledge that gave them overwhelming advantages. Jeremiah stood before the footlocker he hadn't opened in 20 years, its military-issue locks still functional despite decades of mountain weather. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth like sacred relics, lay the tools of a profession he'd tried to forget. His service pistol, field glasses, tactical gear, and most importantly, the combat knife that had saved his life in places whose names still appeared on classified documents. The knife was a thing of brutal beauty, 7 inches of carbon steel, full-tang construction, with a handle wrapped in paracord that had seen action in 3 different theaters of operation. Its edge could split paper or punch through body armor with equal efficiency, and its balance was so perfect it felt like an extension of his hand. For 2 tours in Southeast Asia, this blade had been the difference between coming home and disappearing into jungle graves that would never be found. Running his thumb along the steel, still sharp after all these years, Jeremiah felt the old training resurface. Mission planning, threat assessment, tactical thinking that reduced complex situations to simple variables. Terrain, enemy capabilities, available resources, acceptable losses. The mountains around his cabin weren't so different from the hill. Country of Vietnam, and corrupt officials weren't so different from any other enemy force that needed to be neutralized. Rusty watched with intelligent eyes as Jeremiah laid out equipment on his kitchen table. The dog seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed in their quiet life, that the peaceful routine of mountain existence was giving way to something darker and more dangerous. But Rusty had lived through hard times before. He knew how to follow his master's lead when survival was at stake. The first step was reconnaissance. Jeremiah needed to identify the corrupt officials, understand their operational patterns, and locate the evidence box they'd mentioned. The badge he'd glimpsed suggested County Sheriff's Department, which meant the conspiracy might extend throughout. Local law enforcement. But badges could be faked, transferred between departments, or kept as souvenirs from previous assignments. Using his old field glasses, Jeremiah began systematic observation of the routes leading to and from the hidden cabin. Over the next 3 days, he documented vehicle movements, personnel patterns, and communication schedules. The discipline came back naturally. Patience, attention to detail, the ability to remain motionless for hours while gathering intelligence. What he learned was disturbing. The criminal operation was larger and more sophisticated than he'd imagined. Multiple vehicles used the hidden access trail, arriving at carefully scheduled intervals that suggested supply runs, personnel rotations, and coordination meetings. The level of organization implied significant financial resources and official protection extending beyond simple corruption. More troubling was the realization that he was probably being hunted in return. Twice, he'd spotted movement in the forest. Around his cabin, brief glimpses of figures who disappeared when observed directly. They were good, but not quite good enough to completely avoid detection by someone with his training. The hunters were becoming the hunted, but they didn't yet realize their quarry had military experience. On the 4th night, Jeremiah made his move, armed with the combat knife and dressed in dark clothing that would blend with forest shadows. He approached the hidden cabin using routes that avoided the most obvious surveillance positions. His military training had emphasized the principle that the best time to gather intelligence was when your enemies felt most secure. Late at night, in their own territory, when their guard was down. The cabin was dark but not empty. A single vehicle was parked in the concealed lot, and dim light leaked around the edges of carefully positioned blackout curtains. Someone was inside, probably maintaining equipment or conducting business that required privacy. Jeremiah moved to the back of the building where he'd previously identified a window that offered the best observation angle. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see the older man from before, the one with the sheriff's badge, sitting at a table covered with documents and photographs. The man worked methodically, sorting papers into different piles, as if organizing files or preparing for disposal. Occasionally, he would hold up a photograph to examine it more closely, before placing it in what appeared to be a burn pile. Jeremiah recognized some of the images even from his limited viewing angle. Crime scene photographs from Thomas Mitchell's original investigation, pictures that should have been filed in official evidence rooms, but were instead being prepared for destruction in a remote cabin. The systematic elimination of evidence confirmed that the conspiracy was preparing for something, probably a final cleanup that would erase all traces of their decades-long operation. But it was what happened next that made Jeremiah's blood run. Cold! The cabin door opened to admit the younger man, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, bound and struggling, was a figure Jeremiah recognized with shock. Dale Patterson, the retired forest ranger who'd occasionally checked on Jeremiah's welfare during his early years in the mountains. "Found him asking questions in town," the younger man reported, shoving Dale into a chair. "Seems someone's been talking to him about strange activity up in the mountains." The older man looked up from his document, sorting with obvious irritation. "How much does he know? Hard to say. But he mentioned seeing unusual traffic on the old logging roads, and he's been asking about missing hikers from the 80s. Someone's definitely been feeding him information." Dale Patterson was in his 70s, a decent man who'd spent his career protecting these mountains and the people who use them. Now he sat bound in a criminal's hideout, clearly intended as the next victim of a conspiracy that had already claimed too many lives. Jeremiah realized with growing urgency that he was witnessing the preparation for another murder. "Can't risk leaving him to talk," the older man said, returning to his document, sorting as if discussing the weather. "Too close to retirement to change methods now. Make it look like a hiking accident. Heart attack, maybe a fall. Happens to old men in the mountains all the time." The casual planning of Dale's murder galvanized Jeremiah into action. He couldn't wait for perfect conditions or complete intelligence. A good man was about to die unless someone intervened immediately, and that someone would have to be him. Moving away from the window, Jeremiah began circling the cabin to identify entry points and tactical advantages. The building's construction was simple. Log walls with chinked gaps, a single door in front, and 2 windows on each side. No back exit, which meant anyone inside would be forced to use the front door if they needed to escape quickly. The vehicle parked outside was a late-model pickup truck with enough ground clearance for mountain roads, but no special modifications for tactical use. 2 men inside, at least 1 firearm visible, unknown additional weapons likely present. 1 elderly hostage who would need protection during any confrontation. Jeremiah found himself thinking tactically for the first time in decades, his mind automatically calculating fields of fire, cover positions, and approach routes. The training never really left. It just waited beneath the surface until circumstances required its return. Tonight, those circumstances had definitely arrived. The combat knife felt familiar in his hand as he approached the cabin's blind spot near the generator housing. 7 inches of carbon steel weren't much against firearms, but they would be sufficient if he could get close enough. And getting close was what he'd been trained to do in terrain much more challenging than this. Through the window, he could see the older man had finished sorting documents and was now preparing what looked like an interrogation setup. Dale Patterson remained bound to his chair, but his eyes were alert and defiant despite his obvious fear. The retired ranger had spent decades dealing with dangerous situations in the wilderness. He wouldn't break easily, which meant his captors would eventually resort to violence to get what they wanted. Jeremiah made his final preparations, checking his equipment and reviewing his tactical plan one more time. 2 targets, 1 hostage, Unknown weapons, confined space with limited exits. Not ideal conditions, but he'd worked with worse odds in Vietnam. The key was speed, surprise, and accepting that some risks were worth taking when innocent lives hung in the balance. As clouds moved across the moon, darkening the forest around the cabin, Jeremiah began his final approach. The combat knife rode in its familiar position on his belt, ready for the work it had been designed to do. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that had once been comforting, but now seemed like a warning that the mountains were about to witness violence. Thomas Mitchell had died in these mountains because no one had been there to protect him from corrupt officials who valued their criminal operation over human life. Dale Patterson wouldn't suffer the same fate, not while Jeremiah had the training and tools to prevent it. The war he'd thought he'd left behind was about to come full circle in a remote cabin where justice had been perverted and innocent men had died. But this time, the outcome would be different. This time, someone would be there to fight back. As he reached the cabin's back wall and prepared to breach the building, Jeremiah whispered a promise to the mountain darkness. "Not tonight, you bastards. Not on my watch." The back window of the cabin had been left slightly open for ventilation, a tactical error that would cost the criminals dearly. Jeremiah moved with the fluid silence of a man who'd spent 2 tours learning that noise meant death, his weathered hands finding purchase on the window frame without disturbing the surrounding structure. Through the gap, he could hear the interrogation beginning in earnest. The older man's voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating civilians, but Dale Patterson's responses were steadfast, despite his obvious fear. "I've told you everything I know," Dale was saying, his voice strained but resolute. "Someone's been asking questions in town about old missing person cases. I don't know who, and I don't know why they're interested in cases from the 80s. But you were curious enough to start looking into it yourself," the younger man accused. "Rangers keep records, old man. We know you've been digging through files that should have stayed buried." As Jeremiah listened, he noticed something crucial, a 2-way radio sitting on the table next to the document piles, its green LED indicating an open channel. The device was obviously part of a communication network that connected this remote operation to other locations, possibly including official law enforcement frequencies. If he could access that radio, he might be able to gather intelligence about the full scope of the conspiracy. But first, he had to neutralize the immediate threat to Dale Patterson. The window opened wider under gentle pressure, old wood and metal yielding silently to Jeremiah's careful manipulation. Military training had emphasized that successful operations depended on patience and precision. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to casualties. Tonight, he couldn't afford either. Inside the cabin, the interrogation was escalating. "Last chance, Ranger," the older man was saying, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Tell us who's been asking questions, and maybe we can work something out. Keep playing stupid, and you'll have an unfortunate accident on your way home tonight." "Go to hell," Dale replied with the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent his career standing up to bullies in various forms. "I've dealt with worse than you two in 40 years of ranger work." Jeremiah eased through the window opening, his boots touching down silently on the cabin's wooden floor. The interior layout was exactly as he'd observed from outside, a single room with the interrogation taking place near the front door, his targets positioned with their backs partially toward his entry point. The tactical advantage was his, but only if he maintained the element of surprise. The radio crackled suddenly, making both criminals freeze. A voice emerged from the speaker, official, authoritative, and clearly coordinating multiple units. "Base to all stations. Be advised we have reports of unusual activity near the Granite Creek area. Maintain patrol schedules and report any civilian contact immediately." The transmission confirmed Jeremiah's worst fears. This wasn't just a local conspiracy involving a few corrupt officials. It was a coordinated operation with multiple personnel and official law enforcement resources. The radio network allowed them to monitor and control a significant area of the mountains, ensuring that their criminal activities remained undetected and uninterrupted. "Roger, base," the older man responded into the radio. "Station 3 maintaining position. No civilian contact reported." The exchange revealed crucial intelligence. The criminals were using official law enforcement communication protocols, which meant the corruption extended into active duty personnel, not just retired officials with old badges. Station 3 suggested multiple operational locations throughout the mountains, each one probably involved in different aspects of their criminal enterprise. But the radio also represented an opportunity. If Jeremiah could capture the device intact, it would provide evidence of the conspiracy and access to their communication network. Real-time intelligence about their operations, personnel movements, and coordination strategies would be invaluable for building a case that couldn't be covered up or dismissed. The younger man had moved closer to Dale's chair, clearly preparing to escalate the physical intimidation. "The time's up, old man. Start talking, or we start with your fingers and work our way up to more important parts." Jeremiah knew he had to act before the situation deteriorated into torture and murder. Taking a deep breath, he moved with the deadly precision that had kept him alive in jungle firefights decades ago. The combat knife came out in one fluid motion as he stepped into the light, announcing his presence with the cold authority of someone prepared to use lethal force. "Step away from him," Jeremiah commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military authority. "Both of you, hands where I can see them, right now." The two criminals spun toward him with shock and growing alarm. The younger man's hand moved instinctively toward a pistol holstered at his hip, but froze when he saw the combat knife in Jeremiah's experienced grip. The older man's eyes narrowed as he recognized the tactical disadvantage of their position, caught between an armed opponent and their only exit route. "Who the hell are you?" the older man demanded, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "Someone who's been digging around that old pine tree," Jeremiah replied, watching both men carefully for signs of aggressive movement. "Someone who found Thomas Mitchell's body and figured out you bastards killed him." The radio crackled again with another transmission. "All stations, report status. We have confirmed civilian presence in the operational area." This time, neither criminal responded to the radio call. Their attention was entirely focused on the armed man who'd just walked into their secure location and announced knowledge of their decades-old crime. The silence on the radio frequency would eventually draw attention from other units. But for now, Jeremiah had the advantage of surprise and position. "Cut me loose," Dale called out, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "These two have been planning to kill me and make it look like an accident." Jeremiah kept his eyes fixed on the two criminals while moving slightly toward Dale's chair. The tactical situation was precarious, two armed opponents in a confined space, with the added complication of protecting a hostage. But he'd faced worse odds in Vietnam, and this time he was fighting for justice rather than politics. The standoff stretched for seconds that felt like hours. Three armed men calculating odds and advantages while Dale Patterson remained bound. To his chair between them, the radio continued its periodic chatter, each unanswered call from base, increasing the likelihood that reinforcements would eventually investigate the lack of response from Station 3. "You're making a big mistake, old man," the older criminal said, his hand inching toward the service weapon on his belt. "You have no idea what you're walking into here." "I know enough," Jeremiah replied, shifting position to keep both men in his field of vision. "I know you killed Thomas Mitchell in 1987. I know you've been running criminal operations in these mountains for decades, and I know you're planning to murder Dale here to keep your secrets safe." The younger man's eyes flicked toward the table where the radio sat among scattered documents and photographs. Jeremiah caught the movement and understood immediately. They were planning to call for backup, to turn this confrontation into a coordinated assault that would overwhelm his tactical advantage. "Don't even think about it," Jeremiah warned, taking a step closer to the table. "Move toward that radio and I'll put this knife through your throat before you can speak." But as he spoke, Jeremiah's own eyes caught something among the evidence spread across the table that made his blood freeze. Among the photographs and documents being prepared for destruction was an object he recognized from Thomas Mitchell's personal effects, a small 35mm camera, its metal body dented and weathered, but still intact after 36 years. The camera represented more than just another piece of evidence. Film from that era, if properly stored, could still contain images that might prove crucial to understanding what had happened during Thomas's final days. If the criminals had kept the camera all these years, instead of destroying it immediately, they might have preserved the very evidence that would ultimately convict them. "That's Mitchell's camera," Jeremiah said, nodding toward the device on the table. "You kept it as a trophy, didn't you? Couldn't resist holding on to something from your perfect crime." The older man's face darkened with recognition that his opponent knew far more than they'd anticipated. "You don't understand what you're dealing with here. This operation has protection at levels you can't imagine. Kill us, and you'll just be painting a target on your own back." "Maybe," Jeremiah acknowledged, "but at least Thomas Mitchell will finally get justice." The younger man made his move then, lunging toward the radio while simultaneously drawing his sidearm. But Jeremiah had been anticipating exactly this action. His military training, providing split-second tactical analysis that allowed him to react before his opponent could complete the motion. The combat knife left his hand with the fluid precision of decades-old muscle memory, 7 inches of carbon steel spinning through the air to embed itself in the younger man's shoulder before he could reach either the radio or complete his draw. The criminal screamed and stumbled backward, his weapon clattering across the floor as shock and pain overwhelmed his nervous system. Simultaneously, Jeremiah dove toward the table, scattering photographs and documents as he rolled to put the heavy wooden surface between himself and the older man's return fire. The pistol barked twice, sending splinters flying from the table's edge, but Jeremiah was already moving toward the dropped weapon with the flowing urgency of someone accustomed to combat situations. Dale Patterson, despite being bound to his chair, had the presence of mind to throw his weight sideways, toppling both himself and the chair toward the cabin's front wall and out of the direct line of fire. The retired ranger's quick thinking removed the hostage variable from Jeremiah's tactical calculations, allowing him to focus entirely on neutralizing the remaining threat. The older man was attempting to flank around the table for a better shooting angle when Jeremiah's hand closed around the dropped pistol. Military training took over completely. Acquire target, assess backdrop, squeeze trigger smoothly without disturbing sight picture. The weapon discharged once, the bullet taking the corrupt official in the thigh and dropping him to the cabin floor with a howl of pain and rage. "Game over," Jeremiah announced, rising from cover with both weapons now under his control. "Time to start answering questions instead of asking them." The radio crackled again. "Station 3, respond immediately. We're showing no communication. For 15 minutes. Dispatch is en route to your location." Jeremiah moved quickly to the radio, keying the microphone with practiced ease. "Station 3 responding, all secure here, minor equipment malfunction, but everything's operational now. Copy, Station 3. Maintain standard patrol schedule, base out." The successful radio deception bought them time, but not much. Eventually, the criminals' absence from their regular check-ins would draw investigation, and Jeremiah needed to secure evidence and get Dale to safety before that happened. Moving to where Dale lay tangled with his overturned chair, Jeremiah quickly cut the ropes binding the retired ranger. "You okay, Dale?" "Better than I was 5 minutes ago," Dale replied, accepting Jeremiah's help to stand. "Thought I was done for when they grabbed me in town." "What were they asking about?" "Someone's been asking questions about old missing hiker cases, particularly from the 80s. They wanted to know who it was and what information had been shared," Jeremiah looked toward the camera, sitting among the scattered evidence on the table. Looks like we're about to give them more answers than they bargained for. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, but the larger conspiracy remained intact. Multiple stations, coordinated operations, official protection at high levels. This was far from over, but now they had prisoners, evidence, and most importantly, Thomas Mitchell's camera with whatever secrets it might still contain. The mountains had finally given up one of their darkest secrets, but the fight for justice was just beginning. 6 months later, the FBI investigation had unraveled a corruption network that reached into 3 counties and involved over a dozen officials in various law enforcement agencies. Thomas Mitchell's camera, when finally developed by forensic specialists, had contained the smoking gun, photographs of the criminal's drug manufacturing operation, taken by an observant geologist who'd stumbled across something he wasn't supposed to see. The older man, retired Sheriff Deputy Marcus Hawkins, had received a life sentence for murder and conspiracy. His younger accomplice, current Deputy Sheriff Cole Bennett, would spend the next 25 years behind bars. 7 other officials faced federal charges ranging from corruption to conspiracy to commit murder. The network that had protected their mountain operation for decades crumbled under the weight of evidence that could no longer be suppressed or ignored. But for Jeremiah Boone, the legal victories felt hollow compared to the personal cost of the last half year. The media attention had been relentless. Reporters camping near his cabin, helicopters disturbing the mountain peace, curiosity seekers treating his valley like a tourist attraction. The sanctuary he'd built after Sarah's death had been invaded and examined by strangers who couldn't understand what they were destroying. Today, however, belonged to quieter business. Jeremiah stood beside the pine tree where Thomas Mitchell had been entombed for 36 years, a collection of smooth river stones in his weathered hands. Rusty lay nearby, finally at peace, in a place that no longer carried the scent of old violence and hidden secrets. The tree itself had been carefully excavated by forensic specialists, every piece of evidence catalogued and preserved for the trials that followed. What remained was a hollow shell of its former self, scarred but somehow still alive, still growing despite the trauma it had harbored for so many years. Nature's capacity for healing and forgiveness put human efforts to shame. Jennifer Mitchell had come to claim her husband's remains 2 months ago, a grey-haired woman in her 70s who'd carried the burden of not knowing for over 3 decades. The reunion had been heartbreaking and healing in equal measure, closure that allowed both her and Thomas to finally rest. She'd been buried beside his wife in Missoula, with a headstone that bore the dates of his too short life and the inscription, "Beloved husband, truth seeker finally home." But Jennifer had asked Jeremiah to create a memorial at the site where Thomas had died, something to mark the place where her husband's search for geological truth had cost him everything. The stone cairn he was building would serve that purpose, a simple monument that honored both the victim and the place where justice had finally been served. Each stone had been selected carefully, chosen for its shape and weight, and the way. It fitted with the others. River rocks smoothed by decades of mountain water, granite pieces that had weathered countless storms, quartz fragments that caught and reflected the morning light. Like the investigation itself, the cairn would be built one piece at a time, each element supporting the others, in a structure that would endure long after the people who built it were gone. As he worked, Jeremiah found himself thinking about the changes the last 6 months had brought to his life. The isolation he'd cherished was gone forever, but in its place had come something unexpected: purpose. Letters arrived weekly from families of other missing persons, people who hoped that Thomas Mitchell's case might lead to answers about their own lost loved ones. Cold case investigators consulted with him about remote area searches. The expertise he'd developed through 20 years of solitary living had found new application in helping others find the closure he'd helped bring to Jennifer Mitchell. Dale Patterson visited regularly now, the retired ranger having developed a friendship forged in the crucible of shared danger. They'd taken to hiking together, two old men who'd learned that even in their 70s there were still wrongs to be righted and battles to be fought. Dale had been instrumental in helping coordinate the search for other potential victims, his knowledge of the mountain's history proving invaluable in identifying locations where evidence might still be found. The criminal network's collapse had revealed the scope of their activities over the decades: drug manufacturing and distribution, illegal logging operations, poaching of protected species, and yes, at least 3 other murders of people who'd gotten too close to their secrets. Bodies were still being found in remote locations throughout the region, each discovery adding years to already lengthy prison sentences. But it was the changes in himself that surprised Jeremiah most. The bitter anger that had driven him into isolation after Sarah's death had been replaced by something more constructive, a commitment to ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the uncertainty that had plagued Jennifer Mitchell for 36 years. The mountains that had been his refuge were now his workplace, though the work felt more like calling than obligation. Rusty lifted his head as footsteps approached through the forest. A young woman in Forest Service uniform emerged from the trees, her official bearing softened by genuine respect for the place she was visiting. Maria Santos had been assigned as the new district ranger, tasked with rebuilding public trust in law enforcement presence in the mountains. "Mr. Boone," she greeted him respectfully. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Jeremiah replied, setting down the stone he'd been positioning. "Jennifer asked me to include agency representatives when we dedicated the memorial." Maria nodded, removing her hat as she approached the growing cairn. "The service wants to formally apologize for what happened here, and for how long it took to discover the truth. Thomas Mitchell deserved better protection from the people sworn to serve him. He got justice in the end," Jeremiah said simply. "That's what matters now." They stood in comfortable silence as he placed the final stone atop the cairn, a piece of white quartz that would catch sunlight and moonlight equally, marking this spot for as long as stone endured on the mountain. The memorial was modest but perfect, visible to anyone who sought it out, but unobtrusive enough not to disturb the natural beauty of the place. As the autumn sun climbed higher, painting the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and amber, Jeremiah felt a peace he hadn't known since before Sarah's death. Thomas Mitchell's spirit could finally rest. His family had closure, and the mountains were clean of the corruption that had tainted them for so long. The stone cairn would endure through seasons and storms, a testament to the idea that truth, like water, always found a way to the surface eventually. And Jeremiah Boone, no longer hiding from the world but actively engaged with it, would continue the work of helping others find their own peace in these ancient mountains that kept so many secrets but, given time and patience, eventually revealed them all.